Hello, my name is Liz Burton-Crow, and I'm the Director of Education for the Carrillo Center for Nonviolence. Welcome back to Living One, our monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision of a future in which humans and other animals live as one community in peace and wellness. Given all that's unfolded in the past several years, these conversations are more important than ever. For they are more than mere conversations. They are opportunities for building community, salve for the isolating wounds of our time. Through Living One, together we attempt to answer the question, we know it's wrong, but what does right look like? This month, we welcome Lis McLoughlin, PhD, a talented writer and nature advocate. Lis holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, a Master's in Education, and a PhD in Science and Technology Studies. She founded NatureCulture, which is nature-culture.net, whose mission is to bring people in closer right relationship with the rest of nature, and through which she directs the Writing the Land project, which you can find at writingtheland.org. Her published works include edited anthologies, academic articles, poems, personal essays, a stage performance, book chapters, and a monthly newspaper science page. In her spare time, Lis organizes the annual Authors and Artists Festival and serves on the Northfield Historical Commission. She lives off-grid in Northfield, Massachusetts, and part-time in Montreal, Quebec. Thank you so much for being here, Lis, and interviewing Lis today is the founder of the Carrillo Center, Dr. Gabe Bradshaw.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, Lis. This is such a thrill. Last time she was interviewing me in one of her beautiful conferences. So, Lis, I typically do this just to kind of contextualize and orient us all. Can you give us a sort of a feel or describe the arc which has brought you to the work that you're engaged in?
Thanks. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with you. I guess, when I was preparing for this, there's so many ways that you can describe the arc of your story, and each one is true in its own way. So I tried to pick the most relevant. I guess I started out being a poet and always writing. But I come from a middle-class family, and they encouraged me to choose something more practical. So I studied engineering and then became an academic for a little while and moved off-grid to Northfield. And I live in the middle of a beautiful forest here, which has brought me back to my poetry. And then several years ago, Kinder Morgan thought that this was a great place to put a pipeline and a compressor station. And it made me realize that it really isn't enough to just write poetry about nature. I felt like there was just too much work to be done defending it from development. And so after it was a long time, but we finally did fight off the pipeline. And after that, I felt like more work should be done. So I joined the board of Land Trust, Mount Grace, who had done real work against the pipeline. They were wonderful. And then I tried to figure out how can I help defend land from development. And I figured that land trusts already do that. So the way that I thought I could contribute was to figure out a way for poetry to help land trusts. And so I developed a project called Writing the Land, which pairs poets with land trust protected lands, and then produces an anthology that the land trusts can sell to support their mission. And so it's outreach and fundraising for the land trusts, and nature poetry gets put to work in an activist sense.
Lis, I have like so many questions. It's so nice to meet another science nerd, a recovering one. Anyways, I'll refrain from asking you which kind of engineering it was. That's like totally, secret handshake thing. Anyways, but I really want to ask you some more about poetry, in terms of, you were saying that more needed to be done. And yet increasingly in my own experience, I'm finding that I've heard this for years, but personally, I feel like, wow, a different language does need to be engaged in other than science, which has been the voice and authority for the land. Well, we use land as a sort of an overall thing, non-human thing. I mean, also with humans, but particularly with anyone who is not human. And so I guess I feel that maybe what you're engaged in is also really kind of redefining a language which dissolves this difference between humans and non-humans. Can you talk a little bit about that? I guess that's what I want to say is and then maybe as a coda or as a sort of a sub question, isn't poetry activism? I mean, can't poetry be engaged in as activism? And not just the writers, but the listeners of the poetry. And of course, that has a long history in human social revolution and social movements.
Yeah, what a great question. Yes, I mean, in writing the land, I think the first thing to realize is that we're not really writing the land. I mean, the land speaks for itself, and poets and artists are training to listen to those voices and do the best they can in terms of translation for people who don't have the privilege of spending so much time out there. And I'm an animist. I in the sense that the world is full of people and not all of them are people. And so I really think that artists and poets and people who are really trying to translate voices that others don't get to listen to as much are trying to speak for the land, but it's really the land that's speaking for itself, and we're just giving it a shot. In terms of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
In terms of activism, yes. I mean, I don't know. I hope that when you read a poem, you're changed by the poem. But I don't know if I agree that it always is activism, because if you just are changed by it and you don't do anything with that, then it can be kind of just self-indulgent. And that's how I felt about writing poetry. It's one thing to write poetry and you send it out there, and then you're very lucky if someone publishes it for you for free without giving you anything, and maybe somebody trips over it who likes it. But for me, it was I had to think that there's more than just feeding poetry to people who already like poetry. And so to me, the intersection of environmentalists and artists is a very, it has a lot of possibility as a nexus for people who are going to take action to preserve the things that we both really care about, nature.
I remember when Jeff and I were in Russia one time, and we were sitting around with some Russian colleagues, other scientists and their families, and we were talking about how in Russia, when someone asks a question, what do you do? And someone answers, I'm a poet, they go, oh, wow, and ask further. And here in the United States, the experience is, well, yeah, I know, but what do you really do? So, and again, it seems that that's really integral to the work that you're doing, is also kind of redefining poetry or sort of bringing back the authority of poetry. I mean, when you look at Shakespeare, for example, I mean, that was a major vehicle, and it continues to be a major vehicle, you know, his work and others. The Earl of Oxford, because my friend is an Oxfordian, I have to say, so I have to make that clear. He's a Shakespeare scholar. So to me, it's in other words, that kind of shift in terms of how we view poetry and relate to that is in itself a kind of activism.
Yeah, and there's so many groups in the doing this so much better than I am. I mean, there's Poets Ex Hunger, that they create an online poetry anthology about hunger, that anybody can use those poems to help explain that situation to other people. There's 100,000 Poets for Change, who do a yearly sort of day of events of poetry for, you know, social justice type causes. There are all these wonderful groups that are doing this in different areas. And I think it's important for everybody to pick the area that they feel the most passionate about and do what they can in that area. You don't have to worry about the whole thing, because other people will pick up the other little pieces. If we all did just a little bit, then we'd be okay.
In your experience with poetry anthologies and engagement with poetry at the interface of people like the land trusts, you know, that are typically science-based or influenced in that way, has there been a shift? I mean, I know it's been a tremendous asset to them in terms of being able to provide that for funding and things like that and attention. Do you feel there's a shift that you've experienced or that you've witnessed in terms of people who are used to using the language of science or using the language of the environmental policy, et cetera?
I think the thing that surprised me the most is that things are much more interdisciplinary than I expected. Every land trust that I connected with, half the people were poets themselves, or they had poets on their board, or they had poets working for them. And it was just a matter of making connections that were already there and having a way for those people to voice what they're already doing. They have photographers, they have artists. And I think that it's an underlooked kind of connection that's already there. As an interdisciplinary person, I really believe strongly that no one language or discipline has the answers. And I think it's a mistake to think that the rest of the world is relying on only one discipline. I think in academia, it's easy to do that, and maybe in policy, but in my somewhat limited experience in the real world, people may think that they are either math people or English people, but they don't act like it.
In what way they don't act like it? You're just saying that when you visit these places or talk with them, they have poetry or art or
Yeah, I mean, they're trained as scientists, but they are writers, or they're trained as, you know, biologists, or and they take beautiful photographs. You know, they're not they don't let themselves think in interdisciplinary terms as much as they actually do interdisciplinary things, which I think is pretty cool.
There is, however, a gap, or there is a tension, I'm not sure what to call it, between human and non-human. It's very, very strong, even outside of the academic circle. Anthropomorphism. I mean, that's like, it boggles my mind that there's still discussion about it. But someone brought my attention to this story of the whale recently that was caught in nets, and there was a great effort to free him or her. I don't know if it was a female or a male whale, and how she or he, went up to each of the individuals who had participated in freeing him or her, in thanks. And in that interview, they were talking about how, some of the scientists said, well, there was to go further than that is anthropomorphism, so that's still very strong. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that is poetry, I'm just focusing on poetry, you can't get it in a journal. You can maybe put an epigraph or something like that. And that's been a trend among that I see within the scientific. And the only reason I'm saying science is because that's the authority which informs policy. It's the collective authority still that implicitly and explicitly governs the fate of how non-humans are treated and what happens to them in that way. So I guess I'm saying, is there kind of a mechanism, and is there something intrinsic about engaging? What is poetry? In other words, when I write a scientific journal, what's the difference between that and a poem? Is it just the engagement of subjectivity, quote unquote? In other words, where that my feelings, or that I'm using a different kind of modality of insight and information as such to express?
I think there's probably two parts to what makes a poem. The process. So there's something about poetic writing that is more musical or less didactic than straightforward prose. But I think there's also something in poetry that's different in the goal of the poem, that it's not to transfer information, it's to transfer a feeling, or to show you something you didn't see before. So the goal is more fluid, and probably is different for the effect of a poem has more variation. It's different on each person. So if I read your scientific paper and I understand it, I probably get about the same thing as somebody else who reads it and understands it. But if I read a poem and I get it in some way, there's no telling that I'm even in the same ballpark as someone else who gets it. And they could get it in a completely different way.
So in that sense, poetry is, because it engages the listener and gives authority to the listener in terms of meaning, is very different. In other words, there's a power differential, if you want to call it that way. It doesn't dictate. Rather, it's a communication, and then the listener or reader garners an authority by just engagement in that way.
That's an interesting way to frame it. I wonder if it's not always a little bit the case when you're reading, especially, I mean, if I'm reading fiction, it's not going to strike me the same. But maybe there's a little more room for that in a poem.
So has your, evolution over the last, I don't know how, when the pipeline was suggested since then, do you feel like that you personally have radically changed in any kind of way, or not necessarily radically, but in a significant way?
Personally, I feel much more grateful for what I have. It's probably easier to feel grateful for something when it's about to be taken away from you. And also, I feel grateful for the,
It's Joni Mitchell. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. Sorry.
So yeah, and also I feel grateful for the, for the opportunity to do this work that I feel passionate about. I think for a long time, I was just hanging out, doing, things that made me happy, but they weren't bigger than me. And it isn't enough for me now. And I just felt like, whose permission are you waiting for? Mm-hmm. And I guess Kinder Morgan kicked me in the butt.
Yeah. And the NatureCulture program and conferences that you hold, talk about a little bit about that, if you would.
So the Authors and Artists Festival kind of grew out of wanting to do something, because we have the haiku circle here in Northfield, and Vince Trippi has since passed, and it was just before he passed that he didn't think he was going to do the haiku circle again. And I thought, well, we could do something, we have enough poets around. And then the pandemic came, and we decided to put it online. And it's been online both years, and it'll be online again this year. And the idea was that it would be something to do with authors, artists, and then the focus just sort of happened organically, that it became on the environment. And so the one that you were in, was honoring nature, and we made this anthology out of the first 2 years, honoring nature. This is Martin Bridges' work on the cover. And this is essays and poems from the Authors and Artists Festival. And that's the first book. And then the one for Writing the Land, this is the proof. It's not ready yet, but this is the one that's going to be sold to support the land trusts. And this is Poems and Land Trusts. So I don't know. Just seemed like the thing to do.
That's wonderful. And I guess in one of the things I wanted to ask you about was Ian McGilchrist. Do you know who he is? Does that ring a bell? Oh, I think he's Scottish. I can't remember. Anyways, he's from the broader UK area anyways. And he's a professor of, I don't even know. Okay. But anyways, he wrote this book called The Master and the Emissary. I might have that title wrong, but essentially it's this book that you could use as a door stopper. It's like 500, 600 pages, right? And I really, I don't want to simplify it, but an overarching theme of the book, and he brings in the neurosciences, is that we are a left brain culture, and that essentially that their left brain has taken over the collective consciousness in that way. So the extraordinary thing that he did was sort of zoom back, from the left brain, right brain work, which is done at the individual level or within a certain community or whatever, into this whole sort of social, political, economic systems level. So I guess what I'm saying is that to me, the poetry, the way you describe it, art, those genres are ways of sort of revitalizing the right brain and legitimizing the right brain at a cultural level, or a cosmic level, however you want to call it, and in that particular way is bringing a kind of an integration in, which is what he asserts is this need for the reintegration. Of course, this is all related to neurobiologically to trauma, in terms of traumatic healing and things like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, before I studied, before I did this stuff, I used to study gender studies, and Europeans weren't always so focused on mathematics as the highest thing. When women first started studying, they were cautioned to study the simple subjects like mathematics, because poetry and drama and all that was too complicated for their little brains. So over time, whatever became what men were studying became the thought to be the highest and most complicated. And it's nice to hear that some of them are going back to the older ways and enjoying something a little more complex. Having studied engineering and poetry, I have to say that although the way we teach mathematics is quite horrific and puts a lot of people off, doing mathematics is just a matter of learning some rules and doing it. It's not difficult. But writing, to find a good writer is, we still don't know how to teach that, because it's too complicated. So I'm
when you said that, when you say it's too complicated, are you using the quotation marks on that, or
no, I think that there's so much to writing really well that you can teach people to write a decent essay. You can teach people to write to a good level, but the geniuses who write things that move us, that are above what normal people write, they didn't learn it in school with rules. It's beautifully complex.
Or there's an element of, is it related to, it reminds me of, I think his name was Anthony Storr. He was a psychiatrist from the UK, and he did this whole treatise on looking at quote unquote geniuses, a little bit like, James Hillman talked about in the Soul's Code of the Soul. I can't remember, Liz. Anyways, I think it was the Soul's Code. So kind of Anthony Storr is a psychiatrist or psychologist, and he was looking at these geniuses, Charles Darwin and people who, just, created new paradigms, or right? And his kind of, again, his thesis was the idea that these individuals early on in their life, childhood, somehow got derailed, either through illness or trauma, from the social conditioning. In other words, they didn't go to school, or they were kept at home, or something like that. Do you think that's an element then, in terms of quote unquote the genius of writing as such?
Yeah, thinking outside the box certainly helps. I mean, if And that's why it's so scary what's happening to schooling at the K through 12 level right now, where they're just teaching to a test, because that's not real thinking. That's just learning something, how to please somebody on a test. And it's a little bit scary to imagine what these students are going to lack in terms of skills when they get out.
Or if not so much skills, but in terms of, the way, having cut my teeth on C.G. Jung, in this notion of individuation, this whole blossoming, the internal blossoming. I don't know the details of, Rilke's life story. Not that it all has to be the same, but I would argue that somehow he did not get conditioned, or somehow he was liberated from the conditioning, whether it was just genetic or circumstantial or whatever. So to me, I see this as in the sense of the conditioning and the reduction. And that's this, it's an internal thing. So it's not necessarily just skills. It has to do with an internal, which is having to do with the outlook and their ethics and relating and all of those kinds of things, which an unhindered and untethered soul can be nurtured in that way.
Yeah, and if you're being really pessimistic, you could say it makes them, pretty scary politically. If they're all conditioned to sort of follow and check boxes.
Mm-hmm. So in your experience, if you don't mind sharing, you still write poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you describe your process in terms of when, what do you do, in other words, to prepare, or what do you not do? Or, I was kind of thinking about meditation, how meditators, myself included, they always kind of get into this judgment of like, well, that was a shitty meditation. I sat there for 2 hours, right? And all I did was thinking about so-and-so because I'm having an argument with them, or, or some worry or whatever. And I guess I see, in my own personal experience, like writing is like that. When I feel like I kind of hit the groove, it's when there's a space. And I was just describing, and again, this is sort of leading back to the children. Is there some kind of, describe, your relationship with writing?
I guess there's two schools of thoughts for writing poetry. One is somebody asked you, like, how long does it take to write a poem? And some people say 5 minutes, because that's how long it takes to write it down on the page. But my answer is my whole life, because everything that I do is in everything I write. So there are two kinds of poems that I get, so to speak. One is a gift. It just comes into my head fully formed, and it's not me, it's some voice from somewhere else, and it's a gift. And those are my best poems. And then there's something else that's it's a struggle of some kind, where I'm trying to translate something into words. And those poems often take a really long time to write. And I don't usually think they come out as good, but sometimes people like them. So those are the two ways that I write poems. I'm probably not the best example. I'm not the best poet. I work with 120 poets, and I am like close to the bottom of the barrel compared to most.
In your opinion.
Yeah, in my opinion. Yeah.
So, when you were, I just have to bring it down to something like meditation. When you were talking about the gift poems, as
Mhm.
opposed to the work poems.
Yeah.
The work poems are more for a purpose, in other words, that there's an engagement with, I want to write about the pipeline, or I'm making this up, right?
Right.
And as opposed to these gifts, the channel, the conduit kind of thing. Does that figure in?
Usually, the work poems, I'll get just like a line or a fragment of something, and the rest of it, I don't know. And so I'll just have to develop it from there. The other kind is, and it doesn't, I'm not, I spend a lot of time outside in nature. I get up really early, like before dawn, and we'll go out in my stone circle and just kind of hang out and look at the stars or clouds or whatever's out there. But I'm not really meditating. I'm not, I don't have like a practice that I feel like calls anything. It just gives me time to clear my head. And then usually the poems, when they come while I'm in the middle of something. I don't
know. Would you mind sharing one of your poems? One of your
what kind of poem you want?
I got a lot of poems, A to Z.
I do.
I know you do. I guess I would, or not just one. I mean, are there a couple poems that you could share with us that come to mind or come to heart?
Lately I've been writing a bunch of silly poems. I don't know how you feel about that.
Whatever comes to you. It's whatever.
Okay. I'll read you a poem I read at the Northeast Wilderness Trust poetic opening. Let's see. Hold on. Bard. All right. So barred owls, right? This poem is called.
You might want to, excuse me, Lise, might want to talk about barred owls a little bit.
Oh, okay. Barred owls, they're wonderful striped owls, and they make a lot of noise in the woods, especially when they're happy and find one another. We have a lot of them in our woods.
They're also controversial in the sense of the spotted owl, at an kind of a political level, with it, they're making it over the Rockies and quote unquote out competing the spotted owl.
No kidding. Oh, I didn't know they were heading over.
Yeah.
Well, this one, they're very common over here, and their call is "Who cooks for you?" That's what they say. Hoo hoo hoo. So I think you kind of have to know that to get the poem. Okay, not much of a performer, but here's the bard, and it's BARRED and then BARD. Bard perched alone, absent-mindedly nibbling the end of his hemlock branch. He had to finish this poem. He just had to. The love of his life, the short, passionate, striped beauty 2 oaks over in the north, had captured his feathered heart. If only he could woo, woo, woo her onto his branch. He was stuck at the end of the first line. Who cooks for Stu, Lou, Sue? He had it. It's who cooks for, but at that moment, Hank, the husky owl in the lightning-struck pine, sung out, and Bard went back to his hole sadly alone to compose another night song. He'd get it soon. He'd get it down soon, y'all.
Thank you, Lise.
A silly poem.
Why do you call it silly?
Sometimes I get silly poems. I can't help it.
But why do you call it silly?
Comes.
I don't find it silly. I find it very moving. And I guess I want to say is that, I hate just dissecting poems, but I found it very moving. And
Here's-
anyways, yeah.
Here, this is what they look like. Well, thank you. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah. So that's one kind of poem. There you go.
Well, I found it very beautiful.
Thanks.
And I guess I really like it. Maybe there's a silliness to it from your point of view, but I found it very moving. I found tears coming to my eyes.
Oh,
Thank
you.
Is there another poem you might read? I don't want to cram them together, but it would be lovely to hear another poem. Silly or not?
Let's see.
You know what? I do want to bring this. I'll send it to you. I'll try to find some reference. But having lived in the Northwest and having worked for the government with the spotted owl, there was this whole, brouhaha about the barred owl and killing them because they were going to be out competing the spotted owl. And that there was also and I may be getting this wrong, but there was also this notion of the confusion of their calls. I actually was out in the field making spotted owl hooting sounds. I'll just take a little segue here because it is kind of interesting. So when I worked for the Forest Service as a research mathematician for many years, and I was an odd duck, as you can imagine. So all of the politicians would converge, right? The spotted owl issue, this was during Clinton, blah, blah, blah. And so, of course, we would go out. And what happened is that the spotted owls in this particular area, they would come over to get food because every time they heard a car door slam, right? Because all of the politicians would come. The car door would slam and there was some kind of goodie, or I don't know what it was, but it was kind of bizarre. But that I don't know where that has morphed in that way, but it might be something to, that will spur you on to another poem. Well, I'd like to, I think, I'm not sure I want to add any more words now. So I'd like to thank you and open open the floor, open the window for people to talk and ask questions and comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lis.
Thank you so much. It's moving and makes my segue a little bit harder in terms of moving on to our next portion, which will be the Q&A, and even more awkward for me to do now my shameless plug for not only your work, but also that we'll be here again next month. I know we took a little bit of a break, but November 6th will be our next Living One event. So with that said, I am going to share the screen just so that you guys have the website and also the books that Lis had mentioned earlier. Let me pull that up really quick. But that way you have a chance to kind of write them down, or if you want to watch this recording later, you can also see them there. Just get all my buttons in order. Here we go. So here you can see the lovely book covers with that amazing artwork by Martin Bridge. I think I got his name correct. And
Gay
wow.
is in the honoring nature one. She has a really wonderful essay in that.
Oh, okay. Well, good to know. Holding back.
Sales will soar.
Yeah, just to let people know, because they're obviously, interested in your work. So
yeah. So and the Writing the Land project is really interesting. I may have a inclination to kind of join you myself. So if you see me, don't be surprised. But I enjoy the silly poems that are maybe not so silly. I do appreciate that as well. So I see a couple of folks are making a couple notes, so I'll keep this up for just a moment longer and invite you to start thinking about if you have any sort of questions or comments You can either raise your hand, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Or of course, there's that lovely chat box. If you'd like me to read them aloud for you, I'm happy to do that. So while folks are just finishing up making their notes, Lis, I had sort of a really resonance when you were talking about that you can't necessarily make a poet. Like it's sort of a, I don't know, something that happens, like springs forth almost organically. As a younger girl, I used to write poems all the time, or little, even like little songs or things like that. And I remember at one point, some of the adults in my life were very like, keen to figure out how do we sort of, use this to teach other kids how to do exactly what you're doing. And they asked me to come as a, fifth or sixth grader or whatever it was to another sixth grade class at a different school and to tell them, how to write a poem. And I remember being like extremely sort of like stumped about how to tell someone to be myself. So that really resonated for me. I could give some tips, like you could start with the cool thing where it spells a word, and then you could do like that. I don't know, but I just not necessarily so much as a question, but just a comment and a resonance in terms of, I think there's something to be said for that there's sort of a spontaneity or a magic, or, even, like you said, some of them just kind of like come from somewhere. And I feel that, I think, more often than not, if I feel sort of in the groove. So thank you for sharing that, because I think I always had that feeling, but it was never really like articulated until you said it. And so that made me feel like less of a bum sixth grade poetry teacher. So,
well, I mean, you can teach poetry. You just can't make someone a poet. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are great poetry teachers who will help you be better poets. But if you're not a poet, you're not.
But isn't that kind of the purpose of, I mean, that's how I see it, is there really isn't a goal other than, I mean, isn't it mainly, I mean, yes, I'll just say for me, for example, from my writing, I've never been a writer. And you will appreciate this, I had the contractive brain, because in science, particularly mathematics and physics, the less you say, the better, right? So it's kind of like a scientific haiku, right? So the thing is, so I've had to really learn how to write, even though I wrote poetry when I was younger and would read a lot and blah, 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 blah. But in a sense, it's, I mean, that's my experience, is that, yes, we want to communicate. And I've worked hard at learning how to communicate what I felt, like with the elephants. That was kind of my first foray, into writing, communicating what I felt was, something that I could say that would bring people's attention to what elephants were experiencing and what was happening. So yes, there is an importance in terms of, in my mind, of the communication dimension, but also it's the process, where it's the process of bringing voice, just happens to be on paper or computer or whatever, but in human speak in that way. So, to me, it's like when you talk about someone doing poetry, yes, there's certain guidelines, like me, I told it to Liz. Liz was my former student. When I first wrote to Yale, when I was doing my book for Yale, right? Elephants, I wrote this thing and there was a deadline, I'd written my dissertation. I got CC'd. The editor was written by the copy editor, right? And he said, Jean, we've got a problem here. This, this person is like a disaster. What are we going to do? She can't write. And I'm like, oh my God, it was mortifying, right? So anyways, I learned, I'm not sure how it was. I mean, he had a few pointers, but that wasn't it. It was a kind of a liberation. It was an internal liberation, a humiliating moment in my life.
Well, the same thing. My dissertation advisor took me aside and said, your voice on the page is too snarky. You can't write like this.
Mhm.
And yeah, anyway.
So to me, the process also there's a communication part, but to me, it's so relational. Do you know what I mean? You called your thing, your poem silly, and to me, it's a relational thing because it ignites something. Your poem about the barred owl, really ignited something in me. And whether it's a quote unquote good poem or not, in my mind, it's a good poem insofar as the relational spark that came out. So I want to make something real quick before someone else talks. If you ever feel your poems are silly, this is my first poem as a 6-year-old. The sun got up too late. Instead of 7, it was 8. The moon said, "You old sleepyhead, why didn't you get out of bed?" Now, my uncle, with whom I played cards, we also learned how to play cards. He taught me da 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 da. So if you ever feel like you're silly, you just think about my poem in that way.
Well,
but to me, that's what's wonderful about the poetry is that it gives voice, and it's a liberating kind of a thing.
The other side of that whole statement, is that everybody's a poet.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has an authentic voice. The question is, can you find it? Yeah. And if you can, then you're a poet. It doesn't matter what other people think of your poems. But if you can't, and there are people who can't for whatever reason at whatever time of their life, then it makes it hard.
Mm-hmm. Like Bard.
Poor Bard.
You made it 90% of the way. But no, I agree with what Gay said in terms of yes, silly, but I think there is I wouldn't call it a human universal, I'd call it a person universal in terms of expanding the idea of personhood, of even just that idea of trying to get something out and feeling like shit. I mean, there's something about that that's very connecting to Bard and even to our fellow humans as well. I did see a hand. I think Mary may have had a hand up earlier. I don't know if we may have already answered the question, but feel free if anyone else has any questions or comments or poems they want to share or whatever. I made up a snarky poem for one of my ex-boyfriends. It was, "I'm a little bit like soap, the harder you squeeze, the quicker I go."
Good one.
I'm not sure I think that outcompetes mine.
Oh, well, I was a little bit older,
They're all good.
Dating age.
It's all good, right?
Needless to say, he squeezed and he's my ex. So I guess.
There you go.
How that one ended.
Well, I'm going to say something and then someone can interrupt me, but I'll tell you another experience. I remember going to when I was a scientist, again with the Forest Service, there was a graduate student from Yale and she was doing some dissertation, which I should look up. But anyways, she was interviewing, and part of her interviewing with the science, she would talk to everyone, like mill workers, anyone that had anything to do with forestry. And of course, the scientists and the researchers were included. And I asked her, she interviewed me, and I asked her because there was only 2 females there. And I asked her, I said, what are you learning from some of your things? One of the things she would ask is, what's your favorite, describe your favorite forest, and things. And she said, well, I can't divulge stuff. I said, no, I just said, is there things that you're finding? She said, the majority of the men that I'm interviewing all start to cry. And I guess that's, to me, that's why I see this is so important. To be able to even write a poem of mine about, an old growth tree, is that's so stifled. And it's an internalized, in my mind, within my experience within the science world, it's an internalized violence. And it does violence to that individual, and that violence then is perpetuated externally. And I think that the scientific quote unquote style is violent I'm having to read a lot of science articles again, which is, I know, some kind of penance for all my sins. But I have to say, I walk away, I just sort of blink. It's devastating. And I find that scientific writing is devastating to the human soul. And that devastation to the human soul is devastating to nature. Mm-hmm. And it's a violent act. I mean, and I'm not exaggerating. I feel dirty. I feel awful. I feel sick when I read these articles. And that does, not that I haven't written my own. So I'm not alone in that sense. But I just love the idea of engaging the poetry, like your barred owl. I mean, I would love to see journals, of researchers doing poetry like yours, talking about the puma and the poetry, which has can have as much quote unquote information, in it. I mean, it doesn't have to have stats or anything, but what I saw, what I experienced, it's just my own commentary in terms of that.
Diana, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, thanks you all for hosting, and thanks, I think, is it pronounced Lis, or I know you, Liz, but our guest, is it I don't know who the poet's name is, at least. Thank you. And like Gay, I also was crying during your quote unquote silly poem.
Thank you.
And I was really moved by that because I was able to get out of my own, my own thinking mind and really kind of sink into the life of the bard, and their struggles to say what they needed to say. So in kind of similarly to what Gay had just mentioned, I have more of a reflection, and maybe it'll tie into this question, is that it seems that like the scientific writing, at least when I read it, that it's all about pulling things apart. And that your poetry and the genre of poetry or the life of poetry brings things back together again in a way, like and that they don't have to prove anything. And it seems that the scientific writing is all about proving that something is important, and the poems just show up and kind of just dance the imagery or the feeling for us in a way, and they make what seems to be invisible to so many of us actually felt and visible. And so I guess my question is, and it's kind of tied into what Gay had mentioned and some things that came into the conversation, is in your work with the land trust or in your work with different people in the kind of environmental field, which I think we are all in. Why are we so quick to kind of negate that inherent connection between human and non-human? And over the time that you've been in this work, have you seen the places that separation starts to become less apparent? Like it just seems like we're just always trying to go humans here, nature here, humans here, trees here, humans here, and that when there is a connection with a whale, or like I think that image that was recently published of the orangutan, and the that when those connections are presented and shown as something really natural, that all of a sudden that we're just so quick to turn the other way.
So you made two really good points. One is that, science tries to take things apart and sort of parse things out. And I'm a big fan of this author, Alistair McIntosh. She wrote Spiritual Activism. And in that book, he makes the point that things that are sacred are whole. he has a whole list in a beautiful paragraph, and one of them is snow leopards. I mean, just things that cannot be taken apart. They are sacred and whole. And so unfortunately, I think this distinction between humans and the rest of nature is one that persists in the land trust world for the most part. And it persists in a couple different ways. One is I'm a big fan of land trusts that preserve wilderness in the sense of the wild, the will of the land. So as little human interference as possible. And I know that that's not exactly the most popular position right now, but I also believe that that humans are part of nature and that we have to act like it. And the land trusts have a long history of kind of separating out nature and humans and sort of policing what humans do on land and thinking of land as not worth protecting if it's been affected by humans and all these different things. And it's a legacy that they're still working on. I think the main thing to keep in mind is that humans have the choice to act as part of nature or not. And we just have to start acting like it, because otherwise we're kind of sunk, you know?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to just show you a little copy of a painting I did of an owl.
Beautiful.
I think it's a barred owl.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'm wanting to learn more and more about painting animals. I did a mural of wolves in Jacksonville when there was a wolf sanctuary, and I was a mural artist.
Mhm.
And I wrote poetry a long time ago, but I haven't written any lately. It's encouraging to listen to your poems. I really enjoyed hearing them.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a friend who's a mural artist and recently did a mural in a place that is going to be sort of landscaped. It's now a forest, and they're going to make it into part of a bike trail with little picnic tables and stuff. And she did a wonderful mural and put it up in that place of all the animals that would be displaced by this work, that are now using it as a corridor for for getting to it's right on the river. So
Yeah.
I think that murals are an important way to make statements that people really understand in a visceral sense from the pictures.
Like saving the wild horses, which I'm working on right now.
Mm.
I'm working hard for animals on my computer.
Well, animals need space. The link between, I think, the work of protecting land and animals is, 85% of threatened and endangered animals are threatened and endangered primarily because their habitat is being taken away. So if we want to help animals, we need to focus on where they live as well.
I have written to Secretary Deb Howard several times lately because she's allowing the roundup of the wild horses, and licenses have been issued to shoot bison in Yellowstone Park.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm really surprised, shocked by that's being allowed. Poetry is important because it brings out emotion. I really felt your poem about Indigenous women. It's a love song.
Thank you. Yeah.
Winona LaDuke.
Very strong woman and activist.
Yeah, her mother lives here in Ashland.
Hmm.
She's an incredible artist.
Hmm.
Lisa,
I unfortunately have to leave this Zoom because we have a memorial. My daughter, Tanya, and I have a memorial today. She lost her best friend. So I have to leave. But
Sorry
thank
to
you
hear
all.
that.
thank you, Nina. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa, we've worked you hard.
You've been very kind to listen to all my
No,
stuff. Let's just put it nicely.
no, it's wonderful. It's probably exhausting, but are there some things that you'd like to say that to close with? Or
I think the main thing I want to say is that the land and protecting the land from development for me is my passion. And I feel like it's an important basis for a lot of the other environmental work that is going on, because if we don't have land, then we don't really have anything, we just end up with this built environment, and that's not the same, and it's not enough. So
Thank you, Lis. I really appreciate it. And I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of each other at the writing project. And thank you all for taking time on your weekend. I know that, time is scarce. And so we really do appreciate you coming in and spending some of your weekend with us. So thank you so much, Lis, and thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
thanks so much.
thanks so much. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye,
Liz.
everyone.